You're listening to a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
Hello and welcome to a Lunar New Year edition of the US-China Trade War podcast, except this is a week in which both the New Year and the trade war have been put in the shade by a black swan event that has gripped the world. A coronavirus epidemic has come out of the Chinese city of Wuhan and is spreading around China and further afield. As we record, there are 25 confirmed deaths. Whole cities are on lockdown. Here in Hong Kong, the mood is very tense indeed. This does not feel like the usual festive atmosphere of Chinese New Year. We will of course give you an update on all things trade, Trump, Xi and tariffs with China and political economy editors Zhou Xin and Teddy Ng. We will also talk about how this trade war will likely be overtaken by a bitter tech war, and for that I spoke to Alex Capri, an adjunct professor at the National University of Singapore. But with the coronavirus being the undisputed biggest news story of the week, we will give you the full context from our team in Hong Kong and China. Why is this such a big deal? Where is Wuhan and what is its significance in China? You will hear from China Desk reporters Lau and Kinling Lo to get some great colour from the streets of Hong Kong and what's going on in Wuhan itself. Let's get on with the show. I am joined by political economy and China Desk editors Zhou Xin and Teddy Ng in what has been a relatively quiet week in terms of the trade war. The dust has settled on the Phase 1 trade deal, which was signed on Wednesday of last week. And Zhou Xin, there's still some scepticism floating about whether China is able to make the purchasing commitments it's done within market conditions, because this has been a constant mantra. China has agreed to buy $200 billion in additional US imports, but all the way through the negotiations and post-agreement, Chinese officials have used the line within market conditions. Is it possible for these two things to actually be compatible, Zhou Xin?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because when China say it will do it in terms of market conditions, will follow WTO rules, which means the Chinese government will not provide subsidies for purchase of U.S. products. And also, if China cannot deliver the promised purchases of up to 200 billion, China can say, the U.S. side is not delivering enough good products with the right price. So China is saying, yes, we are willing to buy up to 200 billion U.S. goods as you have demanded. But it's with attached strings. It has preconditions. The preconditions are, first of all, the U.S. has to be nice to China. You cannot raise tariffs again on Chinese products. Secondly, your products have to be good, has to be competitive in the market. Have to be quality, in terms of quality, have to be better than those from Argentina or Brazil. And then thirdly, it has to be accepted by the Chinese consumers. And the Chinese government make it clear that we are not going to provide subsidies to U.S. farmers to sell their products in China. And one example, cited by a Chinese government scholar, is the American beef. Okay, China has basically over a decade ban on U.S. beef. Yes. And then that was lifted after the the summit between Trump and Xi in Florida. Mm. And so, in theory, there are no restrictions at all for U.S. to sell its beef to the Chinese market. But because the U.S. beef is so expensive, it can only grab a very, very small or very, very tiny percentage of market share in China, because it cannot compete against, say, beef products from Australia or even Argentina. So, Brazil. Yeah, and so that's a problem. I think that's the same issue China is trying to make. So, yes, the deal has been starting to look a little bit shaky from the day one when we signed it.
Yeah, it didn't take long. I wrote a story on it this week, and the morning afterwards I got an email from a quite angry former US official saying, of course China can make this demand. And my point is, of course it can, but within market conditions is the caveat which is often lost in the discussion. If China's insisting on this, then I think it would be difficult.
Exactly. So for China's... for the U.S. take is now we are going to sell 200 billion products to China. But for China, is saying we are willing to buy 200 billion products from you, but you have to do something to make this happen.
Yeah, and just as a small example of this, Brazilian soybeans are currently much cheaper than American soybeans. So if you talk about being competitive, then they're simply not at the moment. Teddy, from your perspective, you and your team have been focusing on the reaction from some of China's other trading partners to this trade deal, and it's fair to say that some of them are not very happy.
Well, yes, perhaps one of the biggest worries is coming from the EU. What I can say is that the EU is quite frustrated about the deal. Both former and existing, EU officials describe the US-China trade deal as kind of, managed trade. They're worrying that, if, China is going to buy more US products, then what would the European companies end up? We have heard the European, Chamber of Commerce saying that if the deal is implemented, they will start wondering, where the European companies would be in China and how they are going to do business in China. And we have the EU, Trade Commissioner saying that the deal is bad for competitiveness and even job creations. So I think the EU is quite concerned. The other nation concerned, I think, is Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, during the peak of the tariff war, China has increased the purchase from Brazil. I mean, the soybean and other agricultural products. But now that China has reached a deal with the US, it's likely that China may buy less from Brazil.
Yeah, I mean, the mathematics dictate that, you can't keep buying the same amount from everybody, so there has to be someone who's going to lose out. And as I said, coming up to the Lunar New Year holiday, it's been fairly quiet from within China, but we had some Chinese officials in Davos this week. We also didn't have the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, but we did have US counterpart Donald Trump, who declared the mutual love that they have for one another. Zhou Xin, that was a pretty full-on statement from Mr. President Trump. We didn't have anything so fulsome from any of the Chinese officials in attendance, but what exactly did we have?
Let's put this in context. The Trump speech is part of his total bragging about how he has done a great job of, making the U.S. economy looks great, and the China deal is certainly part of it. So, when he says he's in love each other with President Xi, I think he's trying to make a point that he has now get China problem solved, get the problem fixed. We the message from Beijing is like, okay, finally now you're happy, you're not going to levy more tariffs on us. But as for interpersonal relationship between two presidents, I really have no inside information to comment on that.
If only you did. Look, this week, understandably so, the trade war has been relegated from the front page. It's not the biggest show in town. We are currently, undergoing a huge story here in Hong Kong and in Greater China, and that is the outbreak of a coronavirus emanating from Wuhan in central China. Guys, it seems as though after dealing with one crisis, or at least, temporarily dealing with one crisis in the form of the trade war last week, China has lurched into another crisis this week with the Wuhan virus. Zhou Xin, is there a sense that this is one of the black swan events that China has for many years now spoken about, that they need to have the ability to sort of contain that sort of once in a generation event?
Yeah, I have lots to say about this, because it is definitely a black swan for China, and that China has not been handled very in the possibly best way, I must say, because last Sunday I was on duty, and it's the news is already everywhere. SCMP has its own exclusives that has been spread to Shenzhen and Shanghai. Hong Kong is on full alert, and there are confirmed cases in neighboring countries. But information from China is basically nothing. The only statement from the National Health Commission that day was a post, a graph basically saying, please do not believe in these 5 rumors about this virus. This is not SARS. That's the only one. And the Wuhan local municipal, health commission is the only institution that is keeping updated on how many people affected. And basically the latest number was by the end of Friday. And it's Sunday. And then, you can look at then on Monday morning, in the small hours of Monday morning, I think at about 2:00, they finally decided to, they can't cover it anymore. So finally decided to release all the numbers in Beijing, in Shenzhen, and a significant increase in Wuhan. And also, then the whole ban on media has been partly lifted, so the local media can follow on. And then more and more information started to come out. By the end of Monday, the Zhou Nanshan, the famous scientist, already make this statement that, yes, it is confirmed, human-to-human transmission is there. So, and now you look at these last 2 or 3 days, it's kind of the whole nation has been mobilized. But there are lots of concerns with it's a little bit too late. And of course, the most dramatic decision was made yesterday by Wuhan to a de facto lockdown of the whole city. No trains, no flights out, no ships, as, putting the city into kind of war zone or epic center. It's quite extraordinary. Many people are asking the question: had the Chinese government be a little more transparent about the information, maybe we have, the situation today could be a little bit better than when we have now.
For sure. And Hedy, your team has been really keeping on top of this. Literally, you've had reporters up in Wuhan, had their run-ins with the authorities there. But what's the sort of colour from the ground that you're hearing?
Well, the hospital is under heavy burden. I heard that, they are adding like more than thousands of extra hospital beds. And then because there's a long queue lining up, outside the hospital for treatment. And people are very worried because there's no, this is a new virus. And what can kill this virus? We don't know. There's no, known, a treatment for this virus. So I think the scientists are trying every way to explore, the treatment and possible ways to contain this outbreak. And possibly scientists are saying that the peak for the outbreak seasons could be in March. And that means that if there is no effective measures put in place to contain, the crisis is going to be more serious in March that, China may not be able to handle. Yeah.
Very worrying. And as we record, it's Thursday afternoon, and we are just about to break up for Chinese New Year. Lunar New Year here is a huge festival, and it's when a lot of people travel back to see their families in their hometowns across China. And Zhou Xin, just give us a bit of a flavour as to Wuhan's place in China, its size, the fact that people can't travel in or out of Wuhan, and the fact that a lot of people will be, I guess, changing their Chinese travel plans over Lunar New Year. That's going to have a big economic impact, right?
Yeah, yes. For Wuhan, definitely. Wuhan is a city of 11 million people. That's according to the official statistics. Of course, maybe the real number living in downtown area could be a little smaller than that. But we are talking about a city of the same size as London or New York. And it's completely locked down. It's unprecedented in China's history. And, it's a big shock. And you can already see people are scrambling at railway stations and airports trying to get out of the city because you don't know. It's an indefinite lockdown. So you don't know when this lockdown will be over. You are basically putting there, and you don't know how the supplies will be, the medical supplies. Of course, the Chinese government will ensure that there are sufficient medical supplies. There will be enough daily necessities. But nobody knows how long it will last. 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So it's something that is really psychologically it's huge, and also Wuhan is not some places that remote or not significant on Chinese map. I say when we talk about China's top cities, we talk about Beijing and Shanghai, and Wuhan is definitely among the number two. It's more than it's Chicago for the United States, it's Manchester for the UK. It's Osaka for Japan. It's a very, very important place. And also, Wuhan, as Chairman Mao said, is one of the most connected cities in China. It's almost every major railway, high-speed railway, cargo railway pass through Wuhan. And Wuhan is such an important port on the Yangtze River. And also, one small fact is last year, the local Wuhan airport has the fastest growth in passenger handling among all the major airports in China. It has connects to Japan, South Korea, and many Southeast Asia cities. And also, Wuhan is traditionally a university town. Wuhan University is one of the biggest and the most recognized education institution in China. So, to say something like, okay, this city will be locked up for an indefinite time is really could not be imagined before the announcement.
Teddy, just to finish up, give us an idea of what the SCMP team is doing with regard to this virus, and in particular in Wuhan.
Well, we sent our reporters, one reporter and one photographer to walk around in Wuhan, checking around the hospitals and going to this seafood market, which is said to be the epicenter of the outbreak. And which is that, they have the so-called, wild animal trading. So we have done a, few stories of, why Chinese people will eat wildlife animals and how the city, is preparing for the outbreak. But because the situation is getting more dangerous, we have decided to pull our reporters back. So, yeah, they're, now returning to Beijing.
Okay, well, look, it's a traditional time for people to go on holiday here, but all of our reporters are on call. We are on emergency footing, and we look forward to keeping on top of this. Thank you so much, Teddy. Thank you, Zhou Xin. I'm joined by Kinling Lo and Mimi Lau from the China desk here at the SCMP. They have both been reporting on this epidemic, the coronavirus out of Wuhan. Mimi, you've been really busy covering this from a mainland China angle. Of course, for any listeners who may not be familiar, in 2003, there was an outbreak of Sars in China and Hong Kong. And you wrote a piece earlier in the week which really laid out how the situations could be possibly comparable and whether China has learned its lessons from the time of Sars in 2003. How does the reaction this week and last week compare with what we saw back in those days?
Many people are starting to question whether China has really implemented all the recommendations made by the WHO after the SARS outbreak 17 years ago. From the number of experts I've spoke to the past week, a lot of people are actually pointing out that China is not just facing a battle of virus, but also a battle of credibility. Has it been transparent enough? Has it been forthcoming enough with the number of outbreaks? Has it been responding early enough?
So what is the actual official response to date? What have been the proclamations from Beijing and how they're dealing with this?
Beijing has actually attached a huge amount of importance to it. So the next day, the Central Political and Legal Affairs Commission issued another stern-worded online commentary urging all the officials in China to learn from its painful lessons from SARS. It even went as far as saying anyone who deliberately delays and hides the reporting of the virus cases out of his or her own self-interest will be nailed on a pillar of shameful eternity.
Wow, that is very strong language. Whether or not that actually filters into reality, certainly we will see, but I know that there's been some serious criticism to the reaction. Kinling, you've been reporting on the ground here in Hong Kong. We're recording on Thursday evening in Hong Kong, and we've had 2 confirmed cases. What's the general vibe in the city this evening?
In the last few days, I've actually seen a larger proportion of people in public transport starting to wear masks. For example, back on Monday, I think less than 20% of people on the train were wearing a mask. But up to now, until this afternoon, I think a majority of people on the streets I saw were actually wearing a surgical mask. So I think the awareness has definitely been raised because of the surging numbers that were reported in the media. And people are really aware also because of the context of SARS, as we've just discussed. Back in 2003, Hong Kong actually has the highest death toll among more than 700 of people who died from the disease. So people in Hong Kong are hugely aware. And also because the 2 cases that are now confirmed in Hong Kong were both imported cases, and both patients have been to Wuhan. And so people are really worried about the border control.
Yeah, they were planning to protest at the high-speed rail because, of course, that runs from Wuhan into Hong Kong. So there's real disgruntlement that rail has, that line has not been closed as early as possibly it should have. And what's been the sort of reaction on social media, Kinling, and what you're seeing in and around the city? I saw that you were tweeting some examples of the price of masks going way up.
I think most practically speaking, like Hong Kongers were really prompted by the news to just grab masks wherever they could find. Just here in Causeway Bay, one of the busiest shopping districts in Hong Kong. From last night, I understood that masks were for around 200 Hong Kong dollars for one box, which has about 40 masks, surgical ones, really thin ones.
The most basic ones.
Yeah. And then today, I think they are 300 Hong Kong dollars for one box.
That's about $40 US.
Right.
Yeah.
And therefore, we can already see that people are really trying to grab like masks, and the prices have definitely go up. From what I understand, the two biggest e-commerce platforms in China have already set price walls for surgical masks sold online, so people can still get masks at reasonable prices. But from what I saw just 10 minutes ago on the websites, actually the masks are all sold out.
People are taking it very seriously. I was in a taxi back to the office from a meeting earlier and I saw a guy in Central with an entire shopping trolley full of disinfectant as well. So, I mean, Hong Kongers are not taking this lightly. Obviously, the scars of SARS remain fresh. Mimi, when you speak to people back in China, are they very worried about this? Or is it going to ruin the New Year holiday?
Definitely, especially in Wuhan. From a person I've interviewed earlier today, he said all the main roads, all the restaurants, the busiest shopping malls are all empty. It's almost like a ghost town. We are talking about a really important, populated, central China city with a population of 11 million here.
Very sad situation. Before we finish up, obviously it's Chinese New Year this weekend. Mimi, has this changed your plans?
I was going to stock up Chinese New Year food and the groceries with Mom today, but I was called into work. Looks like I'm going to have to work all weekend if this continues, and likely with a mask on.
Yeah. Kinling?
You know, we don't really have 4 days in a row holidays in Hong Kong, and I guess I'll just have to stay home all the time.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you could join us today. Thank you very much. To close out the show, here's an excerpt from an interview I did last week with Alex Capri, a professor at the National University of Singapore. Alex has just written a paper about how, despite the US and China coming to a Phase 1 agreement last week, the real fight is just getting underway, and that is going to be a tech war. This is something you're going to be hearing a lot more about over the coming months, regardless of what we hear about tariffs and trade. He's got some really interesting things to say. Alex Capri, you have just authored a report which is essentially about technological decoupling. And I'm wondering, where do these two huge stories sit in a line with one another?
Well, you know, the trade deal and the negotiations which are focused on tariffs are in a completely different space. These are parallel universes, right? So we have tariffs on the one hand, and then we have the US-China technology rivalry on the other hand, where a number of things are playing out, including the Huawei scenario with the 5G issues. So these are completely disjointed. They're completely divergent issues.
And this is something that, having read your report, it seems almost like an unstoppable force. So regardless of what some people perceive to be, some progress in terms of the actual thawing in the trade relationship, the tech war as you have it, this is something that's not going away anytime soon.
So think of the trade war, if you will, as a subset in a much larger overarching rivalry, a systemic rivalry between two superpowers, which is really the defining issue of this decade and this century. And they will continue to decouple when it comes to sensitive technologies, military type technologies, dual use technologies. So that is really the future.
So you talk about military technology, dual use technology. Why should the average man on the street care about these things?
Well, a big part of this rivalry is who sets the standards. Who sets the standards internationally for 5G? Who sets standards around all the other Internet of Things and the connectivity of issues? And of course, at the heart of those technologies are semiconductors. So what this is going to do is we're going to see a fracturing world. We're going to see global value chains basically breaking up, more localization, more ring fencing of operations and manufacturing. And that means that the man on the street is going to be dealing with devices that have completely different standards, or standards that aren't universally compatible. So that's an immediate impact to the consumer.
Do you see this becoming like almost like two separate tech landscapes, two separate technological civilizations, a bipolar tech world? And, is that something that you can see stymieing what has, until now, for decades now, been the exponential development of consumer technology?
Yeah, well, think about it. The last 3 decades of globalization, you've had research and development spilling across borders. You've had collaborative networks when it comes to the development of a lot of these technologies, both with Chinese companies, American companies, and companies from all over the world. As we see this new scenario emerging, it means that those collaborative networks are also being fractured. That means that human capital is being sliced up and diced up around the world. And so a lot of the benefits, the economies of scale that we saw in the emergence of globalization over the past 3 decades, that's going away.
So if you take it to the nth degree, and this week a lot of people have been trying to pick a winner from the phase 1 trade deal. If this tech war is taken to the nth degree, in the short term and in the long term, which of these sides do you see as losing the most?
It's not a zero-sum game. In the long term, everybody loses because we lose all those benefits that I just described. In the short term, particularly when we're speaking of semiconductors, if, for example, you have the application of export controls and technology controls applied by the Americans, by the Europeans together, and even potentially by the Taiwanese and the Japanese and others, then the short-term loser is absolutely China because of their huge dependence. This is a major Achilles heel. They have a huge dependence on foreign and U.S. technology, in particular when it comes to semiconductors.
Sure, and you talk here about the need for the U.S. to work with allies, erstwhile allies, European Union, Japan, Taiwan, and so on. We've seen little indication in is it 3 years now of President Trump that he's willing to build the requisite bridges in order to form this coalition of allies, which many talk about. Do you see this as being a viable prospect in the immediate term?
I do. I think a lot of the abrasiveness that we're seeing with the Trump administration and traditional allies is around tariffs. But when we talk about the tech issue, there is a fair amount of cooperation going on, and I expect that to increase. In fact, the European Union has approached the United States asking for the development of joint industrial policy around technology, for example. So I see that absolutely increasing, particularly this race to set standards that I mentioned earlier. So I think, again, 2 completely different parallel planes. Tariffs is one issue, but certainly when it comes to the tech war, that's a completely different ballgame.
Certainly something to keep an eye on. Alex Capri, thank you very much for joining us. You've been listening to the US-China Trade War podcast from the South China Morning Post. If you like what you hear, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this podcast wherever and with whomever you feel like. Stay tuned to SCMP.com for all the updates on the stories that we've discussed today. It's the Lunar New Year all over Asia, but as we say here in Hong Kong, Gong Yi Fa Cai, see you next week.
For exclusive first-hand insights and analysis of China's AI industry, you need the China AI Report 2020, produced by the SCMP research team with input from the big names and pioneers in China's AI industry. It's what you need to understand and utilize AI for your business strategy. For an exclusive 50% discount, simply send an email to research@scmp.com and use the promo code EARLYBIRD in the subject header. Offer ends February 2nd. The China AI Report 2020 by SCMP Research.